Hello everyone, Mr. Tanner here, and today we're going to be looking at one of the two main categories of reproduction, and that is going to be asexual reproduction. Later on, we will look at sexual reproduction as well, but for these notes, we're going to focus on what is asexual reproduction, what are the advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction, and what are the 6 different types of asexual reproduction. So let's go ahead and get started. Asexual reproduction is a form of reproduction. Right? And reproduction is making more copies of an organism, and it results in offspring. Offspring are like the children. Offspring that have identical genetic information. And a word you might be familiar with this is essentially that this is a clone, right? If we have all offspring that are genetically identical, then those are clones of one another. In humans, we don't have asexual reproduction, but there is actually one way that we can get to offspring that are genetically identical, and that's if that fertilized egg. So when we're first fertilized, an egg cell is fertilized by a sperm cell, and there's something like 2 or 4, right? Very, very few cells are in that developing embryo. Every once in a while, that embryo splits into 2 cells. So it just splits into 2 completely separate embryos, and that's what we call identical twins. So identical twins, after that cell's been fertilized, kind of are like a form of asexual reproduction. We go from 1 cell to 2, and they're genetically identical. But other than that, there's no way to get genetically identical humans. So let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction. So one advantage is that population growth is very rapid. It happens very, very quickly. In fact, population growth can be exponential. And what this means, exponential growth is like doubling or tripling every single new change, every generation in this case, and it can double. So we could start with 1 cell, and that cell splits into 2 cells, and then each of those 2 cells splits into 2 cells, and now we have 4 cells. And then you can see if each of those 4 cells split, then we would have 8. And then 16. So every single time it can potentially double. And next assignment, you'll explore really how fast exponential growth can be. Now, of course, exponential growth in nature would be limited by resources. There's not unlimited food. Not all of the cells are going to survive, so it won't quite reach exponential. But still, the growth can be very, very, very fast. The other way that this can be very good is for organisms that are already well adapted to their environment. And the reason why this works is because they're identical, because all the offspring are identical, they will all be well adapted to their environment. The other thing that's important is the environment must be stable. If the environment is constantly changing, but the organisms are only adapted to one type of that environment, then they're not going to do as well. So they're great for well-adapted environments where the environment is stable. And then the last benefit, and this is a big one, is that you don't need to find a mate in order to reproduce. You don't need to find a mate in order to reproduce. You only need one organism. So one of the big problems with sexual reproduction is needing to find a mate. That is not a problem with asexual reproduction. Now, there are some disadvantages as well. And it's really, the biggest one is that it's harder to adapt to a changing environment. And the reason why that's the case is because all of the offspring have identical genetic information. So if the environment changes and they're no longer suited for it, well, that means all of those offspring are no longer suited for this. And this can cause major problems. And an example of this is actually in bananas. So bananas, as you know them, are not a plant that exists in the wild. They can't breed on their own. They were made from hybrids of different types of plantains that do occur in the wild. But because they are not existing in the wild, the only way to have more bananas is to clone them. So all of the bananas that we eat are genetically identical to one another. And there was a species of banana that was wiped out. It completely went extinct due to a disease that all of the bananas were susceptible to. And this is actually happening again. It's likely that eventually the current strain of banana that we have will eventually go extinct. There's starting to be a disease that is killing them, and all of the bananas are genetically identical. So we could see that happening again, and maybe we'll get another new strain of banana that's made. If you want to think of a sort of like non-example, in humans, since we don't reproduce asexually, we all have genetic differences. So when there's a disease like the Black Plague in the 1300s, or even COVID now, while a lot of people are susceptible and a lot of people will die from these diseases, not everyone will. There's enough variation in humans, so human variation means that even very deadly diseases, like the Black Plague, not everyone died. Something like only a third of people in Europe died, which is still a dramatic number. But if we would have been all genetically identical, it's likely something like the Black Plague or smallpox might just have eradicated us as a species, and there would be no more humans left. So again, when you don't have any genetic variation, diseases or changes to the environment are likely to cause extinction. All right. Let's now look at the different types of asexual reproduction. There are 6 main types. The first is binary fission. Binary fission is the process of mitosis in prokaryotes. And we will look a lot more at mitosis later on in our genetics unit. But for now, really what it means is that you just take one cell, maybe some sort of bacteria. You can actually do this with human cells as well. So you take one cell, and it has its little circular DNA. And what that cell does is it duplicates its DNA, and then it kind of just starts it starts pinching itself off. And now each half of that cell has its own copy of DNA, and then it eventually, we got our little bacterial cilia or flagellum, and then eventually you just split it into completely 2 separate cells, each of which have their DNA strand, and that is mitosis. You duplicate the DNA, and then the cell goes through fission, it splits into 2 new cells. The second type of asexual reproduction is something called fragmentation. So fragmentation is when pieces or fragments of the organism can grow into a complete new organism when they are separated. So a common example of this shown in science classes is something called a planaria, which is a flatworm. Planaria are flatworms. And if you take a planaria, you can split it once or you can split it twice, as is shown here. And every fragment, given time and resources, will eventually grow into an entire new worm. So this head piece grows a new tail. The middle piece can grow a new head and a new tail, and the tail piece will grow a new head. And all three sections will develop into their own worm. And if you look, we've now gone from one worm to 3 worms. That is reproduction just by being split. Another pretty cool thing with flatworm is if you don't cut them all the way in half, if you just kind of slice them partway through, it'll grow 2 new heads. You can get a worm that has 1 tail and 2 heads, which is what's shown here. That's an actual image of a planaria that had that procedure done. The next type of asexual reproduction is called budding. And budding is when an organism creates like a branch / bud, which can detach, and then it becomes a whole new organism. So this is pretty common in a type of plant called a succulent, where what they're showing here is cutting off a branch, and then you can actually just take that branch and you can put it into the soil. Just stick the branch into the soil and it will eventually develop roots and it will grow into a whole new plant. You may have seen something similar in Guardians of the Galaxy, where they took a branch from Groot, stuck it in the pot, and it eventually grew into an entire new Groot. That is actually something that succulent plants can do. Right. Next is something called vegetative propagation. Vegetative propagation. And this will tell you that it's dealing with plants, right? Vegetation is plants. So this is when new organisms grow from horizontal, running along the ground, so horizontal plant structures. Strawberries very famously do this. So you can see out of the stem of the strawberry run these, they call them runners, and then daughter plants, brand new plants, can grow out of that runner. So these runners propagate along, and then you get new plants. Here's an actual picture of one of those runners, and then you can see the new plant starting to form. So that's vegetative propagation. 2 more here coming up. Next one is a pretty bizarre one. It is called Parthenogenesis. And Parthenogenesis is when a female gamete, a gamete is a sex cell, so usually that is called an egg cell. So a female gamete or an egg becomes a new organism without having been fertilized by a sperm cell. So usually in sexual reproduction, that female egg cell has to be fertilized by a sperm cell in order for an organism to develop. But when parthenogenesis takes place, that is not necessary. And this is extremely rare, but it has been shown to happen occasionally in Komodo dragons, where a female Komodo dragon can just grow a new organism out of a cell without that egg cell needing to be fertilized. And finally, the last form of asexual reproduction is spores. And spores are when one-celled reproductive units of some kind can grow into a new complete organism. And it's important to remember, since these are all examples of asexual reproduction, when I say a new organism, it's not like a new plant or animal. It's still a clone. It's a genetically identical offspring, but it's not like a single cell. It grows into a full organism. And a common example is with fungi here. So when the fungi develop out of their gills, they'll drop these little one-celled spores that kind of drift through the wind. And when those spores get cemented into soil, a new fungus will grow from there. And that fungus will be genetically identical. So I know that was a bit of a long set of notes, but it's an important one to understand the types of asexual reproduction and the advantages and disadvantages of creating genetic clones when you reproduce. Thanks for listening.